Welcome to today's video where we will dive into the world of serverless computing. This is the part 1 of a series in which we will learn the serverless framework by building a note-taking app. In this video, we will create our first serverless endpoint and learn the basic commands of the framework. So, without any further ado, let's get started. The serverless framework is a cloud-agnostic tool that allows us to easily develop and deploy APIs in serverless manner. This means that we do not have to worry about infrastructure. We only need to create simple functions that cover our business logic, and the framework set up all required infrastructure for us. To get started with the framework, we first need to install it by typing the command npm install globally serverless in the terminal window. Through this series, we'll be using the Node.js runtime and AWS as our cloud provider, so you will need to have both installed on your local machine. And also, you have to have your AWS account configured. The serverless framework will use the account you have set to create the new AWS resources. To create a new serverless project, type serverless create --template and pick AWS-Node.js. Then --name and provide some name, and finally --path and specify path to your project. Let's wait for this command to finish. After running this command, the project directory structure will look like this. We have the gitignore file, handler.js file, and the serverless YAML file. In handler.js file, we will define the functions for our API, and in the serverless YAML, we will define the configuration for our project, including the functions and their associated events. But before we will explain this file in the detail, let's clean it from the commented code. The service field is the name of your service, which is used as a prefix for your resources on the cloud provider. Then there is a specification about framework version. Then the provider specifies the cloud provider you will be deploying to and its specific configuration options. In this case, we're using AWS as the provider and specifying that our runtime environment is Node.js 12.x version. The function field is where you define the functions that make up your application. In the AWS serverless world, the functions translate into Lambda functions. In this case, we have only one function called hello. The handler field specifies the path to the function in your code that will handle the function's logic. In this example, the hello function is defined in the handler.js file and is exported as a exports.hello. Also, it's a good practice to specify the region for your function instead of using the default one. To do so, you have to add the region field to provider entity. Next, to make the hello function to act as the HTTP endpoint, we have to add a new field to the serverless YAML. The events field specifies the event that triggered the function. In this case, we're using an HTTP event that will trigger the function when the GET request is made to the /test endpoint. To deploy our serverless infrastructure, we simply need to type serverless deploy into the terminal window. After confirming the deployment operation, two things should happen. Firstly, the serverless framework will package up your code and any dependencies into a deployment package. Secondly, it will create any necessary AWS resources, such as an API gateway endpoint and a Lambda function. The resources are created using AWS CloudFormation templates. You can check them in the .serverless directory. Setting up the whole infrastructure takes a while. I will pause here and I will go back when all is set. Great. As you can see, the service is deployed to the stack node app-dev. The serverless framework marks our environment as dev by default, but we can create multiple environments based on the same serverless YAML by changing just one variable. We can also take a look at the list of endpoints our app consists of. To test an endpoint, copy the URL and paste it into a tool of your choice. Once you send the request, you should get a response containing a hello message and Lambda's input. Great, the endpoint works, but how is it exactly working? When deploying the app, the serverless framework created a Lambda function for us. Here in the console, you can see that the name of the function is composed from the service name, environment, and the function name specified in the serverless YAML. The framework also created an API gateway, connecting it with our Lambda function and creating a proper endpoint. Plus, the framework created appropriate IAM role to make the connection work. That's a lot of work done with one simple command. But that was just a basic example. Let's delete the hello function since it's not very useful. To remove the endpoint, type serverless remove and confirm by typing Y. This will delete all previously created resources. Now that we know how to create a simple endpoint, let's move on to creating endpoints that we will use in our node-taking app. Firstly, let's navigate to the handler.js file. Within this file, we will create three essential functions: create node, delete node, and get all nodes. While we won't be connecting to the database today, we will create placeholders for these functions that return the name of each method as a string. Now, let's move on to the serverless YAML file. Inside the functions section, we'll start by removing the hello function. Then we can add a new function called addNode. We will specify two parameters: the handler of the method, which will be handler.addNode, since we want to use the addNode functions from the handler.js file, and the event that triggers it, which will be the HTTP trigger. We will set the method to post and the path to the node. Once we've done that, we can copy and paste the code twice to create the delete node and get all nodes functions, simply changing the names of the functions and the handler method and the HTTP method. To enable the correct deletion, we will add the ID parameter to the path of the delete endpoint. Now, using the serverless deploy method, we can create the necessary infrastructure. Let's wait for a while for this command to finish. Excellent! Here we can see the newly created endpoints. To test the API, let's copy the post endpoint and send a post request. Great! It has been successful. The API has responded with 201 status and proper message. Great! That's all for today's lesson of the serverless framework. We have gone over the fundamentals and created necessary functions for our node-taking app. In the upcoming video, I will demonstrate how to define a DynamoDB database using the serverless framework, as well as how to create, read, and delete resources from it. So stay tuned. In the meantime, thank you for watching and I will see you next time.